In the town of Echo Canyon, sound was a sacred thing. It was a community built in the curve of a massive sandstone amphitheater, a place where a whisper could travel like a secret, and the ring of the blacksmith's hammer would return to you in a dozen different voices. The canyon listened, and the canyon remembered, and in a small, tidy cottage at the town's edge, Genevieve Dubois, the town's piano teacher, understood this better than anyone. At 70, Genevieve was a woman of profound and elegant silence. Her hair, once the colour of polished jet, was now a soft, luminous silver, always swept up in a graceful chignon that revealed the fine, proud line of her neck. Her hands, though spotted with age, were slender and expressive, moving with a pianist's innate grace, whether she was tending her tea roses or dusting the keys of her old parlour piano. Her voice, however, was a ghost. A fire in a New Orleans opera house 30 years prior had taken her husband, and through smoke and trauma had stolen her legendary singing voice, leaving her with only a strained, fragile whisper. She had fled the ashes of that life, seeking a place where the silence was not an absence, but a presence. She had found it in Echo Canyon. Here she was, not the nightingale of New Orleans, the celebrated soprano whose voice could fill a concert hall. She was simply Mrs. Dubois, the quiet woman who taught the town's children their scales and arpeggios. She taught them rhythm and harmony, the architecture of music, but she never sang. Her lessons were given in soft whispers, with hands that demonstrated on the keys what her voice could no longer convey. The town respected her quiet sorrow, leaving her to the solitude she so clearly cherished. She was a part of the town, but like the canyon itself, she remained at a distance, an observer of the lives that played out below. Her carefully orchestrated peace was first disturbed by a tragedy. A flash flood, born of a sudden mountain storm, had roared through the lower mining camp, taking with it 3 of the town's men. The canyon, which usually echoed with the sounds of work and life, now seemed to echo only with grief. The community was wounded, left with a void that ached with unanswered questions and a deep collective sorrow. Into this void stepped a man who promised answers. His name was Reverend Jonah, and he arrived not on a tired horse, but in a smart, well-kept buggy. He was a man in his prime, with a handsome, earnest face, a head of thick, dark hair, and a voice that was a marvel. It was a rich, resonant baritone that could soothe like a cello and command like a trumpet. He claimed he was just passing through, but felt a divine calling to minister to the grieving town. He held his first service in the town hall, and the entire community, hungry for solace, attended. Jonah did not speak of damnation or fire. He spoke of healing, of light, of a joyful noise that could fill the emptiness left by loss. He spoke of building a new church, a true beacon in the valley, and of forming a choir of angels whose voices would rise up and heal the canyon's heart. His charisma was a warm balm on a raw wound, and the town, desperate for comfort, embraced him completely. Genevieve watched from the back of the hall, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She recognized the performance. She had seen it 100 times in the opera impresarios and theatrical producers of her past. The masterful control of an audience, the carefully modulated emotion, the seduction of a beautiful sound, promising more than it could ever deliver. A cold knot of unease tightened in her chest. The person most affected by Jonah's arrival was Willow, a slip of a girl 10 years old. who had been orphaned in the flood. She was a shy, watchful child, taken in by the town's blacksmith and his kind wife Martha. Willow possessed a secret, a gift known only to a few. She had a singing voice of breathtaking purity. It was not loud or powerful, but clear and true as a silver bell. But her grief and shyness were a cage around it. She rarely spoke and sang only when she thought no one was listening. Her soft melodies weaving through the birdsong in the woods. Willow was Genevieve's most gifted student. The child had a natural understanding of music that went beyond the notes on the page. In their quiet lessons, a profound bond had formed between the old woman who could no longer sing and the young girl who was afraid to. Genevieve would play a melody and Willow would respond, not with her voice, but with her eyes, a silent, perfect understanding passing between them. Reverend Jonah, with his keen eye for assets, soon discovered Willow's gift. He overheard her humming one afternoon and immediately saw her potential. She was not a child to him. She was an instrument. She would be the centerpiece of his choir of angels, his star soloist, a living testament to his miraculous ability to bring forth beauty from sorrow. He began to court her his charm, a thick, sweet honey. He praised her voice, calling it a divine gift he was meant to nurture. But Willow, preternaturally sensitive, felt the possessiveness beneath the praise. She shied away from him, her silence becoming more absolute. When charm failed, Jonah's approach shifted. He began to speak to her guardians, Martha and the blacksmith, about the Christian duty to share such a gift, subtly implying that their reluctance might be seen as a lack of faith, a thing that could have social consequences in a town now so firmly in his grip. Terrified, Willow stopped singing altogether. She stopped humming. In her lessons with Genevieve, she no longer looked at the piano keys with quiet joy, but with fear. Genevieve knew she had to intervene. She went to Martha, a woman she had known for years. "Martha," she whispered, her voice a strained effort. "Be careful of that man. A beautiful voice can be used to hide an empty heart." Martha, a good and simple woman, was torn. "But Genevieve, he has brought such comfort to the town. He speaks of hope. You heard him." "I heard him," Genevieve whispered back. "And I have heard many men like him. They build their kingdoms on the hopes of others." Her whispered warning was no match for Jonah's booming sermons. The town was his. He established a church building fund, and donations poured in the meager savings of widows, the hard-earned wages of miners. He held revival meetings at the mouth of the canyon, his powerful voice echoing in a way that felt like divine pronouncement. He began to subtly preach against those who were quiet in their faith, who clung to worldly grief instead of embracing his joyful noise. He never mentioned Genevieve by name, but everyone knew who he meant. The town that had once respected her silence now began to view it with suspicion. She was an outsider, once more isolated by her quiet dissent. The final straw for Genevieve was when she saw Jonah try to physically pull Willow onto the makeshift stage during a service. The girl froze her face, a mask of pure terror, and burst into tears. Jonah, momentarily losing his composure, showed a flash of cold anger before masterfully turning the moment into a lesson on childlike humility before the Lord. That night, Genevieve made a decision. If she could not outshout the liar, she would have to find another way to reveal the truth. She knew that men like Jonah, who built their lives on illusion, always had a past. She began her own quiet investigation. She wrote a letter, a difficult, painstaking task with her limited voice, to an old friend in New Orleans, a retired journalist who had a long memory and a network of contacts. She asked him to inquire about a preacher named Jonah, known for his beautiful voice and his fundraising for new churches. While she waited for a reply, she focused on Willow. She had to give the child a shield. She had to teach her that her voice was not a performance to please others, but a vessel for her own truth. The lessons changed. Genevieve stopped teaching scales and began telling stories. She told Willow about her life in New Orleans, about the joy of singing, the thrill of the stage, the power of a voice to move 1,000 hearts. And then for the first time in 30 years she spoke of the fire. She told the story in halting whispers, her hands shaping the images in the air. She spoke of the smoke, the screams, the terror. She spoke of losing her husband and of waking in the aftermath to find her own voice, gone, a part of her soul turned to ash. Tears streamed down her face as she relived the trauma, but she did not stop. "They took my voice, Willow." She whispered, her hand on the child's shoulder. "But they could not take my music. It is still in here." She touched her own heart, then the child's. "Your voice is yours alone. It is not for him. It is not for the town. It is for you. You must sing what is true in your own heart, even if it is a sad song. A true sad song is more holy than 1,000 false hymns of joy." A week later, a letter arrived for Genevieve. It was from her journalist friend. The story it told was a familiar one. Reverend Jonah, whose real name was Jonas Black, was a swindler wanted in 3 territories. His method was always the same: find a grieving, vulnerable community, charm them with his voice, collect funds for a new church, and disappear just before the first stone was laid. He had left a trail of broken trust and empty coffers from Missouri to the Rockies. Genevieve now held the truth, a quiet, damning piece of paper. But how could she make a town under a spell listen to a whisper? The climax came on Founders Day. Jonah had announced it would be the grandest revival yet, the day the choir of angels would make its debut, and the day the final, largest collection for the church would be taken. The entire town gathered at the mouth of the canyon, the rock walls creating a natural cathedral. A large wooden stage had been built. Jonah was at the height of his power, his voice rolling through the canyon, promising prosperity and divine favor. Then he called for his star, and now our little songbird Willow, healed from her grief by the power of faith, will lead us in a hymn of praise. He turned to get the girl, but she was not where she was supposed to be. Instead, the crowd turned as a slow, deliberate sound began to fill the air. It was the sound of Genevieve's old parlor piano, which the blacksmith had quietly moved to the edge of the gathering. Genevieve sat at the keys, her back straight, her silver hair gleaming in the sun. She began to play. It was not a hymn. It was a soulful, heartbreakingly beautiful nocturne, a piece full of sorrow, loss, and a fragile, resilient hope. It was music that spoke of her own life, of the fire of the silence. It was her truth offered without a single word. Jonah, furious at the interruption, tried to preach over the music. Do not listen to this worldly music of sorrow. Listen to the voice of joy. But his words sounded hollow and tinny against the profound, honest emotion of the piano. The town fell silent, captivated. The music was telling them a story more real than any sermon they had heard. Then a new sound joined the piano. It was a single, pure note, clear and high. Willow, who had been standing beside the piano, stepped forward. Inspired by Genevieve's courage, she had found her own. She did not sing one of Jonah's grand hymns. She sang a simple folk lullaby, a song her mother had sung to her, a song of the valley. It was a song of home, of quiet love, of real loss. Her voice, small but perfect, rose into the air. The canyon took it, held it, and gave it back amplified into a chorus of breathtaking beauty. It was not a performance. It was a prayer. It was the canyon's true echo. The townspeople listened and they understood. They saw the lie in Jonah's loud promises and the profound truth in the old woman's music and the child's simple song. The spell was broken. At that moment, the sheriff, who had received Genevieve's information earlier that day and had been waiting for the right moment, stepped onto the stage. He held not a Bible, but a wanted poster. Jonas Black, the sheriff, said, his voice firm and clear, "You are under arrest for fraud." The chaos that followed saw Jonah's swift and ignominious departure. The town was left in the quiet aftermath, not with the shame of being fooled, but with a newfound understanding. They had been healed not by a false prophet, but by the quiet courage of two silent women who had dared to share their true voices. Genevieve Dubois never regained her singing voice, but her home was no longer silent. It became the heart of the town's music, filled with the sound of her piano and the voices of children, led by Willow learning to sing. She had spent 30 years in silence, believing her purpose was over. But in teaching a small, frightened girl how to find her own voice, Genevieve, the woman who carried an echo of loss in her heart, had finally taught the entire canyon how to sing its own true song.